Okay, welcome everybody to the first of our colloquium series for this year. I'm really happy that everybody was able to attend today, and we have a great series, so make sure you check the posters and the website to see who's coming next. I'd like to turn it over. A couple of things we're going to be filming today if you haven't noticed, so make sure to, if you have an issue with that, to let somebody know or sit in the back. Please make sure you sign the sign-in sheet before you leave, okay, so we can know who's here. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Russo now, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Great. Well, welcome to Colloquium, everyone. Nice to see you. So in this age of Google, Twitter, Facebook, and you name it, the long list of social networking sites and tools and environments, some might ask, who needs libraries? It's a fair question, right? Steve Dunning, writing in the September issue of Forbes magazine, observes, quote, "Libraries are under threat everywhere. After all, who needs a library today, when it's possible, even without getting out of bed, to find and read almost any book or article that's ever been published," end quote. Right? Yeah. More than a century earlier, Paul Otlet articulated his vision for the disembodied world library that would provide one-stop access to knowledge. He wrote, quote, "Everything in the universe and everything of man would be registered at a distance as it was produced. In this way, a moving image of the world will be established, a true mirror of memory. From a distance, everyone will be able to read text, enlarged and limited to the desired subject, projected on an individual screen. In this way, everyone from his armchair will be able to contemplate creation in its entirety, or in certain of its parts. Yet, despite these claims and utopian visions, libraries persist. Indeed, in 2012, approximately 1/3 of Americans, 93 million, attended a public library program, representing about a 36% increase over an 8-year period. Now, in that same period, in that same year, public libraries circulated about 2.2 billion items, about a 28% increase over the same period of time. It turns out that Americans love their libraries. But why? We're delighted to welcome to Colloquium this afternoon Dr. Wiegand, and he's going to hopefully provide some insight into these questions. Dr. Wiegand is the F. Williams Summers Professor Emeritus of Library and Information Studies at Florida State University and former director of the Florida Book Awards, often referred to as the Dean of American Library Historians. You probably get tired of hearing that, right?
No.
That's good. No. He's the author of more than 100 articles and numerous award-winning books, including An Active Instrument for Propaganda, American Public Libraries During World War I, and Irrepressible Reformer, a biography of Melville Dewey. His most recent book, which I have a copy of right here, Part of Our Lives, A People's History of the American Public Library, published by Oxford University Press, released just this month, is a must-read for all who seek to more fully understand the enduring role of libraries in civil society. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Wiegand to the podium.
Thank you. I was standing near all those folks because I'm carrying the mic, not because any other reason. Thanks for having me. Second time I've been to the UCLA campus. I think the first time was when I did a biographical sketch of Lawrence Clark Powell. And this is the room named after Lawrence Clark Powell. And I was always amazed at the number of urinals over in the Powell Library when I came through. My wife and I were doing some hiking in the valleys near Lake Tahoe the other day, and on the rear bumper of my car I have a bumper sticker that I got from a head shop in Santa Fe. I heart my public library. And when we came back from our hike, there was a little note underneath my windshield wiper saying, "I love my public library too. Way to go." Okay? Now, that kind of emotional attachment is really what I was after. I have a huge goal here today, to persuade you to broaden your thinking about libraries in general and what public libraries accomplish for their users in particular. I'm motivated in large part because of conclusions that emerged from research on this book you see, Part of Our Lives, A People's History of the American Public Library. My goal in that book was to find out historically why people have loved these ubiquitous civic institutions, and love them they do. A 2013 report by the Pew Research Center's Internet and American Life Project noted that in the previous decade, every other major institution, and that includes government, churches, banks, and corporations, has fallen in public esteem except libraries, the military, and first responders. The study also found that 91% of those surveyed over 16 years old said libraries are important to their communities, and 98% identified their public library experiences as positive. Another Pew study found 94% of parents believe libraries are important for their children. 84% said because the libraries develop a love of reading and books. In my historical narrative, I didn't take the conventional user in the life of the library approach. Rather, I took a library in the life of the user perspective because I wanted to trace the history of the public library not so much by analyzing the words of its founders and managers, but mostly by listening to the voices of people who used them since the mid-19th century. Thus, instead of a top-down view, Part of Our Lives adopts a bottom-up perspective that features the voices of generations of public library users. Largely because of recent technologies, and I say recent because I'm an old person, this is all old stuff to you guys, uncovering many of these voices was not difficult. Very time-consuming, yes, but not difficult. Some are in published memoirs, autobiographies, and biographies of the famous, some in manuscript collections and archives across the country. The vast majority, however, are fixed in thousands of U.S. newspapers and periodicals digitized since the 1990s into huge databases. By using public library as a search term, I found thousands of voices in letters to the editor, thousands more quoted in stories reporters wrote about local libraries. As I analyzed this data, I was surprised at how quickly it organized into three main categories. In no particular order, let me see if I've got, okay, good. In no particular order, people have loved their public libraries for the useful information they made accessible, for the public spaces they provided, and for the transformative potential of commonplace reading they circulated that helped users make sense of their worlds. First, a few historical examples that comfortably fit the category of information as we currently define it in library and information studies. While sitting at a Cincinnati Public Library desk in 1867, Thomas Edison compiled a bibliography on electricity. A colleague later recalled, many times Edison would get excused from duty under pretense of being too sick to work and make a beeline for the library, spending the entire day and evening reading such works on electricity as were to be had. In 1899, Wilbur and Overwright came upon an ornithology book in the Dayton Public Library that rekindled their interest in human flight, one of their biographers writes. Whoops, I'm sorry. In a Detroit Public Library reading room in the 1950s, a teenage female pored over comedians' printed monologues. She appeared in short monodramas written by herself without makeup and hardly any props, Lily Tomlin's biographer later noted, conjuring up not only the personality of the character she portrayed, but also that of unseen people with whom she was talking. About the same times in Hot Springs, Arkansas, 10-year-old William Jefferson Clinton discovered the Garland County Public Library. I'd go there for hours browsing among books, especially those on Native Americans, which probably explains that shirt. In a Detroit ghetto in 1962, Sonia Carson, a single African-American mother frustrated with poor school performance and all the television her 11-year-old son Benny and his older brother were watching, made a decision. From now on, she said, you boys can watch no more than 3 programs a week. Instead, they were to go to their local Detroit Public Library branch. You're going to read at least 2 books every week. And at the end of each week, you'll give me a report on what you've read. Since I always, two books sounded like a big assignment, Carson later remembered, but he reconciled to the order. Since I've always beloved animals, nature and science, I chose library books on those topics. I began looking forward to my trips to the library, in part because librarians came to know him and would tell him about new books. I thrived in this new way of life, and soon my interests widened to include books on adventure and scientific discoveries. By reading so much, my vocabulary automatically improved along with my comprehension. You recognize this guy? Okay. In 1971, 10-year-old Barack Obama returned to Honolulu from Jakarta. First place I wanted to be was in a library, he later recalled. Often he had a specific information need. One Saturday, with the help of a raspy-voiced old librarian who appreciated my seriousness, I found a book on East Africa. Obama wanted information about Kenya, birthplace of his father, a Luo tribe member. The Luo raised cattle and lived in mud huts and ate cornmeal and yams and something called millet, the book read. Their traditional costume was a leather thong across the crotch. Shocked by what he read, Obama left the book open-faced on a table and walked out without thanking the librarian. Now, all these people had information needs an American Public Library met, and the anecdotes I've read nicely fit into the traditional discourse of library and information studies, profession that focuses primarily on information. In many respects, a professional discourse functions like a big intellectual sandbox. Plenty of room to play with ideas, but one nonetheless with limits. A social boundary, if you will, in which the profession's leaders employ a formal way of thinking to educate and enlighten members who often implement what they learn to improve professional service for the public's greater benefit. For librarians, that translates into services they institute and maintain, and collections and spaces and resources they make accessible. For most of its history, LIS Discourse is focused on what in the 18th century was called useful knowledge. I have to check the slides, make sure I'm all settled here. In the 19th and 20th century was called best reading, and that best reading is still part of the American Library Association motto, the best reading for the greatest number at the least cost. And in the 20th century has morphed into information. This focus term gives particular meaning to the phrase access to information that to this day dominates the profession's thinking and imposes boundaries on its intellectual sandbox. But the American Public Library is a unique civic institution because, unlike most other civic institutions, courts and schools, for example, people don't have to use it. As a result, over the generations, users have heavily influenced the process of shaping public library collections and services. LIS Discourse, however, does not address in any direct way this kind of bottom-up pressure, and for me was not comprehensive enough to explain what I was discovering about library as place and the transformative power of stories users withdrew from libraries over the generations. So to explain my findings, my challenge became how to expand beyond the professional discourse, how to see outside the boundaries of LIS's limited sandbox of ideas, how to craft a framework that accommodated and explained the voices of library users I was uncovering in my research. To illustrate the importance of library as place, let me introduce you to Ricky. All right. As soon as I find Ricky, I'm going to get you going there.
My name is Ricky Powers. I live in San Francisco and I've been here for about a decade, and I'm currently unemployed, but I do go to school. My apartment is about this big and I don't have any room for a desk, and so I come to the library to do my homework. But it's also just a great resource. I like to come to the gallery and see what shows they have going on. I come to lectures, I come to see films that they do. Mayoral debates, I've been here for a couple of those as well. Well, the reason that I'm here is because I think it's just important for people to understand. So when I first moved to San Francisco, I told you I went broke, and I was literally starving. And I had a place to live, but the library kept me warm, and it did. I'll get it together here in a second. There was a truck that came outside once a week, and I could go and get food there. And like I said, they have computers so that I could work on my resume and I could apply for jobs. And did I mention that it was warm here? So it's been there for me when I needed it. And it's a valuable resource. And oftentimes I think that people see the library as someplace for kids or someplace for homeless people. And there are just normal people like me that might need it as a resource, and I'm grateful that it's here.
That's the first of 3 trailers I've incorporated into the PowerPoint that come from a documentary being developed on the American Public Library by 2 San Francisco filmmakers. That's scheduled to be out probably in early 2017. And it takes a look at the library through the eyes of library users rather than through the eyes of library managers and library funders. Okay, more anecdotes from my narrative. During the summer of 1939 at the Atlanta Public Library's African American branch, one of the few places in the segregated city where blacks felt safe and welcome, 10-year-old Martin Luther King came to the library many times during the week, Director Annie Waters later recalled. He'd walk up to the desk and look me straight in the eye. "Hello, Martin Luther," she would respond, always calling him by his first and middle names. "What's on your mind?" "Oh, nothing particularly." For Waters, that was a cue that King had learned a new big word, and they then initiated a conversation in which King used the word repeatedly. Another game involved poetry. Again, King would stand by the desk waiting. "What's on your mind, Martin Luther?" Waters would ask. "For I dipped into the future, far as the human eye could see," he responded. Waters immediately recognized the poem and finished the verse. "Saw a vision of the world and all the wonder that would be." When the Cincinnati Public Library opened a piano room in 1955, among its first visitors was 12-year-old Jimmy Levine, as he scribbled his name in pencil in the room's sign-up sheet. 8 visits later, he changed his signature to J. Levine, and finally, James Levine. When he gave a concert for 150 children in the children's room in 1957, he had already performed as a Cincinnati Symphony soloist. Today, he's the New York Mets artistic director. In 1969, the Gary, Indiana Public Library sponsored a local talent contest at which a group soon to be known as the Jackson 5 competed. Although they didn't win, Little Michael was an audience favorite. In 2005, the Washington Post carried an article by Eric Wee, that focused on a District of Columbia branch library in one of Washington's poorest neighborhoods. In it, we reported that every Tuesday night, a homeless man named Conrad Cheek entered the library and set up his chessboard on one of the tables in the children's room. We immediately noticed the transformation taking place. No more ignored pleas for this homeless man, no averted glances. During the next hour, people will look him in the eye. They'll listen to his words. In this Down at the Heels library, he's the teacher. Among his students was 9-year-old Allie Osmond. As we watched this interaction, Allie's mother explained that her son's confidence had soared after playing with Conrad, that he was now bragging to friends about being a chess player. "We owe it all to Mr. Conrad," his mother said. "We love him." Inside the library, we reported, they call him Mr. Conrad. Notice all these very meaningful experiences occurred in a place we call library. To categorize them as information gathering fails to capture their significance in the lives of each of these individuals. Now let me turn to the transformative potential of commonplace stories public libraries have circulated by the billions for generations. Meet Maria.
My birthday was yesterday and I am 95 years old. I started to use the library, I would consider 12, 13 years old, you know. Yes. I was born in St. Petersburg, Russia. We left and we started from scratch. And my English was 0, but their library was a couple of blocks away, and that's how it started. That library was everything to me. We could not afford to buy the books. Books were always expensive, and there were so many other needs. It was library, library, library all the time. And it didn't cost anything. Well, the library fills a certain place in my life, it has to satisfy certain needs. I have seen a lot of very ugly things. And you just can't live all the time with bad. You have to balance it. And my balance was mostly to see something beautiful. And so I would go to the library and spend a couple of hours. But when I come out on the street, I'm a completely different person. It gave me such a relief, so, as French would say, soulagement, you know.
A few more anecdotes from my narrative. In a 2008 interview, 88-year-old Pete Seeger recalled an early life reading experience. At age 7, a librarian recommended me a book about a teenager who runs away from his stepfather who's beating him, and is adopted by a middle-aged Indian whose tribe was massacred and whose wife was sold into slavery and is living alone. That he remembered this so vividly 80 years after reading it is testimony to the power of stories, and in Seeger's case, a New York Times editor noted upon his death earlier this year, fitting for someone who went on to engage issues of conscience. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan wrote the daughter-in-law of Harold Bell Wright, whose best-selling 1920s religious novel, That Printer of Udell's, Reagan had read as an adolescent in Dixon, Illinois. Wright was no favorite of contemporary literary critics. H.L. Mencken called him a liberated yokel from the cow and hog states. Another critic was equally as harsh. Harold Bell Wright supplies more negative data on the literary quality of the taste of the fiction reading public than any other author. No matter to young Reagan, however, shortly after reading the book, he declared himself saved and was baptized. The novel's protagonist, Reagan wrote Wright's daughter-in-law 60 years later, served as a role model that shaped his life ever since. It's highly likely the copy of That Printer of Udell's Reagan read came from the Dixon Public Library, which he visited twice a week in the early 1920s, mostly to check out Frank Merriwell and Sherlock Holmes stories, Tarzan novels, and books by Horatio Alger, Zane Grey, and Mark Twain, many of which he read on the library's front steps. "I'm a sucker for hero worship," he later admitted. For Oprah Winfrey, reading commonplace stories was an open door for freedom in my life and allowed me to see that there was a world beyond my grandmother's front porch in Mississippi, that everybody didn't have an outhouse, that everybody wasn't surrounded by poverty, that there was a hopeful world out there and it could belong to me. To Winfrey, the stories became her comfort, her solace to commune with and learn something about myself, to learn something about other people, to learn something about the world. In a small Milwaukee apartment she shared with her brother and mother, as a 9-year-old in 1963, she read a public library copy of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, her first all-night book, the story of Francie Nolan, whose life was full of humiliation and whose only friends were in books lining the public library shelves. I felt like my life was hers. After her father died in 1963, 9-year-old Sonia Sotomayor buried herself in reading at her Bronx library and the apartment she shared with her mother and her brother. Nancy Drew had a powerful hold on my imagination, she remembered. Every night when I'd finished reading and got into bed and closed my eyes, I'd continue the story with me in Nancy's shoes until I fell asleep. Her mind, she noted, worked in ways very similar to Nancy's. I was a keen observer and listener. I picked up on clues. I figured things out logically, and I enjoyed puzzles. I loved the clear, focused feeling that came when I concentrated on solving a problem and everything else faded out. Her reading that summer, she admitted, was her solace and only distraction that got her through this time of trouble. All these anecdotes point to the power of printed commonplace stories to change people's lives. But stories reside in all cultural media. If you watch television, go to the movies, read popular magazines, and look at advertisements, notes Richard Keller Simon, you're exposed to many of the same kinds of stories as someone who studies the great books of Western civilization. You've simply been encouraged to think of them differently. Stories, Richard Nash argues, constitute recipes for the imagination. Media scholar Henry Jenkins adds, stories are basic to all human cultures, the primary means by which we structure, share, and make sense of our common experiences. Now, meet Danny.
One of the things that, say, the library offered me was that it was a place where I could actually absorb American pop culture. I grew up in an immigrant household, so I always, like, the library for me was always the place where I could get free media. When I was a teenager, I was like really big into like punk rock culture and the music scene. So, and I couldn't afford records, so I was always going to the library. Whereas my friends were able to either buy their records with their parents' money or worse yet, steal it. I would always go to the library and check them out. When I was a teenager, I think I might have been like 15 years old. I had heard about a film called A Beautiful Thing, which is based on a play, and it's a gay film. I remember going to the library and looking up in the catalog and like making sure like nobody saw me, and I went to the stacks, I found it, I kind of hid it underneath like a stack of books, like sandwiched between a stack of books, and I checked it out. I took this video home, I had to hide it from my parents. And I remember watching this film, and it was so powerful to me. It was a love story between two young British teenagers, and for me, it dropped a certain anchor down where, on an emotional level, I didn't feel like I was floundering somehow. So that felt really good, and I remember playing that cassette tape, that VHS tape, over and over and over again late at night when everyone in my house was sleeping. I would sneak out to the living room and I would play this video that I had borrowed from the library like at least once a night for 3 weeks in a row, sometimes repeating certain scenes over and over again just because for me they really spoke to me. And then I would renew it.
Most often, public libraries do a very good job of democratizing their spaces and supplying information and stories. Sometimes, however, they don't. For example, when black teenagers refused to leave lunch counters reserved for whites in Greensboro, North Carolina in February 1960, as places, most public libraries in the South were segregated. This is a picture of two beefy white cops taking a skinny African-American teenager out of the Albany, Georgia Carnegie Library in July of 1962. Although most American public libraries had Nancy Drew on their shelves in 1963, the New York Public Library did not. Their librarians considered series fiction trash. Instead, Sonia Sotomayor got her copies of Nancy from her mother for good behavior. The New York Public Library didn't drop the ban on Nancy until 1976. The San Francisco Public Library did not drop it until 1996. Then there were the pulp paperback titles from the 1950s and 60s that many gays and lesbians read voraciously and considered survival literature. They were never reviewed in Booklist magazine, listed in fiction catalog, or acquired by public libraries. What public libraries often gave them instead was misinformation. Because she believed libraries are the place where we can be most anonymous and delve deeply into areas we wish to uncover in secret, one 15-year-old later recalled, It was to the library I turned in 1969 to uncover the meaning of my lesbianism. And what I found was not echoic of my own experience. Rather, those books frightened me and convinced me that this was not lesbian I was experiencing, but something else. Although public libraries cannot be all things to all people, part of our lives shows that they've been more things to more people than most cultural authorities, including many librarians, have realized. I bring this to your attention today because I think American public libraries have opportunities to exploit possibilities made visible in part of our lives by stepping outside the conventional sandbox of ideas. So here's the part about broadening your thinking about libraries in general and what public libraries accomplish for their users in particular. The research I did for part of our lives convinces me that people love their public libraries not only for the access to information, but also for the places they make available and the commonplace reading materials they supply. Our ability to understand the importance of the latter two in the everyday lives of public library users, however, is greatly limited by the professional discourse we've inherited from previous generations. One that was already evident in the first order Benjamin Franklin submitted to a London bookseller in 1732 for the new Library Company of Philadelphia that he and others started. For example, it listed no fiction. Filled instead with the dictionaries, grammars, and atlas histories and books on science and agriculture, one historian noted, the 46 titles were suited to the tastes and purses of young tradesmen. In other words, Franklin wanted his library company to nurture the self-made man his Poor Richard's Almanac celebrated. As he saw it, fiction had no role in that process. By privileging useful knowledge, by prioritizing information above stories, Franklin unknowingly reinforced a discourse librarianship has followed to the present day. But that discourse overlooks and undervalues some pretty impressive community roles that are reflected in recent public library statistics. Remember back in the 1980s when many evangelists of information technology predicted the demise of public libraries by the turn of the century? They were wrong, dead wrong. In 2012, which is the latest year for which we have statistics, the U.S. has more public libraries than ever. 17,219, including branches and bookmobiles, excuse me. That's over 3,000 more than the number of McDonald's restaurants in this country. And while public libraries provided users with access to 250,000 internet-ready computers, 100% more per capita than a decade earlier, equally impressive were statistics addressing the library's place and the circulation of commonplace reading. You're going to hear same of the statistics that Mark mentioned in his introduction. In 2012, the number of visits, 1.5 billion, represented an increase of 21% over the previous decade. In 2012, 93 million Americans attended a public library program, an 8-year increase of 38%. 65 million attendees were children, a 24% increase from the previous decade. In 2012, public libraries circulated 2.2 billion items, including audio and video materials and ebooks. That's a 28% increase from 2003. And circulation showed a per capita 10-year increase of 17%. To understand what these statistics mean in the everyday life of public library users, we have to go outside LIS Discourse, outside that intellectual sandbox of ideas we inherited from previous generations of LIS thinkers who primarily addressed issues of information access. To better illustrate this point, let me cite Susan Pinker's recently published book, The Village Effect: How Face-to-Face Contact Can Make Us Healthier, Happier, and Smarter. In it, she harnesses research in the fast-developing field of social neuroscience to demonstrate that substantial benefits accrue to those who experience high levels of face-to-face contact, including improved vocabularies, an increased ability to empathize, a deeper sense of belonging, and perhaps more important, a longer lifespan. As I pondered her conclusions, a compelling question flashed into my mind. What if the face-to-face contact American public libraries make possible in so many ways enables users to live longer, happier, and healthier lives than non-users? And if we find out that public library users do live longer, happier, and healthier lives, certainly a researchable question, what are the reasons this is happening? The answer to questions like these have to expand our traditional focus beyond access to information in order to include, analyze, and assess the community building benefits of the public library as a place and the positive effects of the sociability that reading, viewing, and listening fosters through the materials it circulates. Library as place. What you see here is the lobby of the Toledo Lucas County Public Library in 2007, the night that a Harry Potter novel was released. And I want you to scan the audience for its diversity. And then ask yourself, what is going on here to the many things that can be happening across genders, across ages, across ethnicities, and across races? Only in recent years has the library profession even begun counting on a national level the number of people attending library programs. Same for listing library exhibits in public library space. And only recently have researchers surveyed users as consumers of library space to determine perceived need. At the same time, however, LIS research has seldom attempted to measure how library spaces function as agents in the interactions of public library users as individuals or as members of larger groups in order to see what and how much they learned. Yet, from a library in the life of the user perspective, knowing how and why patrons use library space and what they learned there, formally and informally, is essential to understanding why Americans love their public libraries and perhaps help them lead longer, happier, and healthier lives. To explore in part of our lives how people benefited from the American Public Library's place, I adopted the vocabulary of public sphere literature and used words and phrases like public interest, exchange social capital, participatory culture, and civic commons to explain user behaviors. It's easy to see the public library as a player in this theoretical framework. Generations of users demonstrated they valued the public library as a place by voluntarily visiting it again and again. Let me cite one example of common effect of visiting a public library. For many Americans, it constituted the first place in the public sphere where they enjoyed adult privileges, and by obtaining a public library card as a child, formally accepted a civic responsibility to respect public property. That sense of responsibility does not go away easily. One of Captain Chesley Sully Sullenberger's concern after he landed U.S. Airways Flight 1549 in the New York's Hudson River on January 15, 2009, was a Contra Costa California Public Library book he had aboard his plane. It might come back late, he told the library, perhaps even water damaged. Public sphere literature certainly helped me explain why people have historically loved their public libraries. And now there's some contemporary research that shows public library users actually are happier people. In March 2014, Pew Research released a study that demonstrated the more people are engaged with their public library, the more they felt connected to their community as a whole. Public libraries users are more likely to say that they like their communities and that they would call their communities good or excellent places to live, said a Pew Research associate. If we move the questions about personal happiness that the public library as place brings to its users closer to the center of our discourse, I'm convinced we'll generate a lot of answers to the critics who now think library buildings are mere brick and mortar dinosaurs. Same with reading commonplace fiction. Okay, that's my son Andy reading to my grandson Teague, so you can all go, aw, and I'll feel really good about it. There you go, okay. Now, I mean, this is, Teague borrowed this book from his local library, and he's fully capable of reading it, but he wanted his dad to read it to him because they share this interest in this particular subject. That's a dynamic that has been repeated a cajillion times since 1854 when the Boston Public Library first opened. Recent neuroscientific research on reading has demonstrated how narrative, activates particular parts of the brain, including the sensory and motor cortexes. The brain, it seems, does not make much of a distinction between reading about an experience and encountering it in real life, Annie Murphy-Paul notes. In each case, the same neurological regions are stimulated. One researcher found that fiction offered readers the opportunity to enter fully into other people's thoughts and feelings. Another saw substantial overlap in the brain networks used to understand stories and the networks used to navigate interactions with other individuals, in particular interactions in which we're trying to figure out the thoughts and feelings of others. Other researchers point out that reading fiction is an exercise that hones our real-life social skills, and that regular fiction readers seem to be better able to understand other people, empathize with them, and see the world from their perspective. Fiction, notes psychologist Keith Oatley, is a particularly useful simulation because negotiating the social world effectively is extremely tricky, requiring us to weigh up myriad interacting instances of cause and effect. Just as computer simulations can help us come to grips with complex scientific problems, so novels, stories, and dramas can help us understand the complexities of social life. A recent study by the Washington University's Dynamic Cognition Laboratory shows fiction readers mentally simulate each new situation encountered in a narrative. Details about actions and sensations are captured from the text and integrated with personal knowledge from past experiences. The study's lead researcher notes that the brain regions that fiction activates closely mirror those involved when people perform, imagine, or observe similar real-world activities. That public libraries have always played a primary role in making stories accessible to millions of users is pretty obvious, and resonate in the words of Maria, Pete Seeger, Ronald Reagan, Oprah Winfrey, Sonia Sotomayor, and Danny. Ever since the Boston Public Library opened in 1854, fiction consistently averaged 66 to 75% of public library circulation. By force of demand, then, every generation of public library users has insisted on a set of stories acceptable to a majority of community members that contain messages they wanted to read, hear, and view. Circulation statistics I cited previously show they still do. Given the fact that circulating commonplace stories read, heard, and viewed by users continues to be what public libraries do most, and given the high value public library users place on these stories, shouldn't we move analysis of the act and social nature of reading closer to the center of our research? But obstacles stand before us, and here I take on one of librarianship's sacred cows. Just to tease you, in part of our lives, I also take on several others having to do with censorship and intellectual freedom. Now I'm going to take a drink because I don't talk very much in my retired state. In the last 3 decades of the 20th century, ALA's Office of Intellectual Freedom carefully cultivated an ethos that what people read is a privacy right librarians need to protect. This ethos encourages libraries to destroy records of public library transactions immediately after an object is returned. In effect, however, this practice also deprives researchers of valuable data that could be studied to improve services and deepen understanding of the public library's community value. Conventional social science research methods that comply with state confidentiality laws, and here I remind you, librarians do not enjoy the privilege status of medicine and law, easily accommodate analyses of these records, all of which are public transactions for which librarians are publicly accountable. Perhaps within these public library transaction data sets, if librarians preserved and opened them to analysis, future scholars will discover that voluntary reading, the kind of self-directed informal education American public libraries have quietly enabled since the middle of the 19th century, does more to increase literacy of all types than the mechanics of reading forced by formal education, No Child Left Behind federal programs, and Common Core state standards that focus on close reading, nonfiction, and text complexity that reading formulas measure. The testimony of hundreds of public library users, especially recent immigrants, cited in Part of Our Lives, strongly suggests this may be so, but we need research to test this hypothesis. This kind of data could also become central to social science and humanities scholars now building a new research arena called culturomics, an umbrella term describing quantitative inquiries into cultural phenomena using technology to research massive data sets. Since the middle of the 19th century, library and government officials have argued that public libraries' most important role is to provide access to useful information that develops intelligent consumers, creative entrepreneurs, and informed citizens, the kind of information Thomas Edison and Ben Carson pursued in their public libraries that many argue people can now retrieve on their computers at home. But Part of Our Lives demonstrates that public library users have historically shown a different set of priorities. For them, the tens of thousands of spaces public libraries provided for many purposes and the billions of commonplace stories they circulated in a variety of textual forms were at least as important, perhaps even more important, than access to information, and for a whole bunch of reasons. For generations now, adolescent series fiction and adult Western romance, horror, mystery, and science fiction novels have driven public library circulation. They still do. Although commonplace stories like these that they circulated by the billions, American public libraries have helped empower, inform, intellectually stimulate, and inspire their readers, viewers, and listeners like Pete Seeger, Ronald Reagan, Oprah Winfrey, and Sonia Sotomayor. And through these tens of thousands of spaces they made available to their patrons, they've helped construct community in multiple positive ways through the billions of face-to-face encounters they nurtured, just like they did for Martin Luther King Jr. and Conrad Cheek. In my lifetime of research into American library history, I've read thousands of statements like, public libraries are not just warehouses of books anymore. If Part of Our Lives accurately represents public library history, they never were. Yet for effect and contrast, journalists often parroted and reinforced this myth by drawing on these stereotypes and on their own limited public library experiences. If I had $1 for every time I came across this kind of statement in my research, I'd probably make more than the royalties this book will generate. I've also read hundreds of sweeping predictions concerning the future of these ubiquitous institutions, of those grounded largely on a particular definition of useful knowledge in the 18th and 19th century, best reading in the 19th and the 20th century, and information in the 20th and the 21st, of those that ignored the power of library-supplied stories millions now read, view, and listen to daily, and the library's place billions now visit annually. None proved true. I urge you all to keep that in mind as you ponder today's predictions about and plans for tomorrow's public library. Part of Our Lives proves to my satisfaction that public libraries are so much more than information. In addition to providing access to information, for the past century and a half, they've been public places of performance where users displayed moral progress and achievement. They've also operated as a robust commons where members of the public discussed a variety of issues that concerned them. They functioned as centripetal forces to craft a sense of community, local, state, and national, among disparate populations and involve community trust between its multicultural elements. They've acted as key players in constructing group identity through the stories and places they provided, and they've started neighborhood conversations, welcomed the recently arrived into their midst, and served as community anchors. Based on my findings, I argue LIS needs systematic longitudinal studies of the role of the library as place and the impact of reading on users, and to deepen understanding the public library's impact and effectiveness. Absent these studies, 30 years from now, someone is going to discover yet again that the American Public Library is a community center. And the next J.K. Rowling phenomenon will be rationalized as reading is essential, rather than investigated for reasons why readers want these stories and what they learn from them. Access to information, libraries' place, and the transformative potential of reading commonplace stories. I hope conclusions I've drawn from my historical research have encouraged you to broaden your thinking about libraries in general and public libraries in particular. The naysayers, largely ignorant of this library history, are still with us. It's all on the internet, hype many evangelists of information technology. Libraries are dinosaurs, grouse officials looking to cut budgets. I argue here that to combat this limited thinking, we have to extend our scope of analysis beyond information access to include, from a user's perspective, deeper analyses of library as place and the role of commonplace stories. By doing so, my historical research strongly suggests we can document hundreds, if not thousands more ways these incubators of personal happiness and informal self-education contribute to the daily lives of our patrons as individuals and as members of their community, and we can show much more clearly how they function as active and effective agents in the construction of that very community. Thank you.